The highways of Florida are arteries of sunshine and escape. But for 1 year, between 1989 and 1990, they became hunting grounds. The victims were all men. The person responsible was not. This is the story of Aileen Wuornos. The media called her a monster, the first female serial criminal. But was she a cold, calculated criminal who took lives for money? Or was she something else entirely? Was she the product of a life so full of mistreatment, it broke her mind? To understand the end, we have to go back. Back to a beginning so dark it's almost impossible to believe. Her story begins not with malice, but with abandonment. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. She was an outcast from her birth. Her parents were just teenagers themselves. Diane, 16 years old, and Leo Pittman, 19 years old. Their union was brief and bad. They separated months before Aileen was even born. The concept of a father was a ghost in Aileen's life. Leo Pittman was a deeply troubled man who would later be imprisoned for his bad crimes against a youngster. He would never be a part of Aileen's life, ultimately ending his own story in a prison cell. With her father gone, Aileen's mother, Diane, was left alone with two youngsters, Aileen and her older brother, Keith. The family stepped in, and in a decision that would echo through decades, Diane was convinced to give them away. Her mother abandoned the family when Aileen was just 4. That left young Aileen and her brother Keith in the care of their strict, devout Christian grandparents Lori and Britta Wuornos. They were legally adopted, but this was not a rescue. It was a trade from one broken home to another. Aileen's grandfather was described as a man with a bad temper. Under their roof, Aileen's life was bad and unstable. She suffered physical and emotional mistreatment at home. Her grandmother was kind, but her grandfather mistreated her in different ways. Aileen's early years were far from normal. A childhood friend, Dawn Botkins, who would remain loyal to Aileen until the very end. She said Aileen had the worst life of anyone I have ever met. At just 14 years old, Aileen became pregnant in 1971. A son was born, but like Aileen herself, he was immediately given up for adoption. Her grandfather asked the child's adoption shortly after. A mother with nowhere to turn, Aileen dropped out of school and found herself alone. By age 15, Aileen ran away from home to live on the streets. She was alone, with no money, no education, and nowhere to go. She was officially on her own. Kicked out and completely alone, Aileen took to the only place she had left, the open road. Her life of drifting and hitchhiking began. The nightmare was just getting started. For a young girl alone on the highways of America, survival is not easy, minute-to-minute calculation. She began a nomadic life, drifting from state to state, hitchhiking, and sleeping wherever she could, under viaducts, in abandoned homes, even in cow pastures. To survive, she engaged in the only trade she had, selling her companionship. She later called it work on the highways. This era hardened Aileen. She would later make a claim, estimating she had been with over 250,000 men. More chillingly, she stated, "I must have been attacked, I'd say, about 30 times, maybe more." But she'd add a defiant, heartbreaking twist. "I'm tough." A wussy woman? It would have bothered her. Her brother, Keith, was the only person in her early life she felt connected to. Their shared mistreatment manifested in a brief and deeply inappropriate relationship. A neighbor at the time even claimed to have overheard them. It's a detail that's difficult to process, but it speaks to the profound emotional and moral vacuum they were raised in. They had no one but each other. In 1976, another blow landed. Keith, whom Aileen genuinely loved, passed away from cancer. It was another devastating loss, another person ripped away from her. But his passing came with a strange, temporary reprieve. Aileen received $10,000 from his life insurance policy. For someone who had lived hand-to-mouth for years, it must have felt like a fortune. But Aileen had no concept of money or stability. The $10,000 vanished in weeks. In a desperate attempt to buy the normal life she never had, she bought a luxury car. That fantasy, like all the others, ended abruptly when she totaled the car in a crash just a short time later. The money was gone. She was back on the road, back to square one, but now she was even more alone than before. Her life became a revolving door of crime. She was arrested multiple times for small-time offenses, driving without a license, disorderly conduct, check forgery. She even had a brief, ill-fated marriage to a much older, wealthy man, which ended in arrests. She was a pinball, bouncing from one situation to the next. She was a ghost drifting through the underbelly of society, unseen and uncared for. For 10 more years, Aileen Wuornos would continue this spiral. By 1986, she was 30 years old, weathered and hardened by a life most of us can't even imagine. She had given up on finding any kindness in the world. And then, in a dimly lit bar in Daytona Beach, Florida, she met her. The one person who would change everything. the one person she would truly love, and the one person who would, in the end, be her undoing. In 1986, Aileen Wuornos walked into a bar in Daytona Beach, Florida, and met Tyria Ty Moore, a 24-year-old motel maid. For Aileen, it was like seeing in color for the first time. Ty was quiet, stable, and offered Aileen something she had never known: genuine affection. A connection was immediate and intense. They became inseparable, and for the next 4.5 years, they built a life together. For Aileen, this relationship was everything. It was the first time she felt she had a home, a family. Aileen shows her struggling to explain the depth of this bond. "We never left each other except for when we worked," she said. "I was a cook. I was cooking for Ty. I cleaned the place for Ty. I loved her so bad." This love for Aileen was all-consuming, but it was also possessive and desperate. She finally had something she wasn't willing to lose. This relationship, however, didn't solve their fundamental problem: money. They were poor, constantly struggling to pay for motel rooms and food. Aileen continued her life on the streets, selling companionship to men. But now she had a new motivation. She wasn't just surviving for herself, she was providing for Ty. And with that new motivation came a new, darker element of protection. She says, "That was quite the love, wasn't it? The only reason I carried that tool is because I loved her so much. I wanted to make sure I got home alive, in one piece, so I'd be another day breathing with her." She had a .22 number tool, and she was carrying it with her. This, right here, is the nexus of the entire case. Aileen claimed her life on the road was fraught with danger, that she had been attacked countless times. The tool, she said, was for protection. But the prosecution would later paint a very different picture. That was a tool of the trade, used to rob and dispose of her clients. This love for Ty became the central pivot of her life. According to Aileen, every decision she made, every risk she took, was to keep their fragile life together. In a later, frantic phone call from jail, she would scream this at Ty: "Because I fell so badly in love with you that I was so worried about us not having an apartment, and I was scared that we were going to lose our place." By late 1989, their financial situation was more desperate than ever. They were behind on rent, and the pressure was mounting. Aileen was out on the highways trying to make money, carrying her tool and filled with a desperate, protective love. It was a lethal combination. In late November 1989, a 51-year-old electronics store owner named Richard Mallory picked up Aileen Wuornos near Daytona Beach. On December 13, 1989, the 51-year-old Richard Mallory was discovered dead in a wooded area in Volusia County, Florida. He had been missing for weeks, ever since his car was found abandoned. Mallory had been attacked multiple times by Tool. It was a clear, unlawful taking of life. But police had few leads. It was a tragic event, or so they thought. What the police didn't know was that this was the beginning of Aileen Wuornos' final chapter. As 1990 unfolded, they would discover that Richard Mallory was not the only one. He was just the first. After Richard Mallory, 6 months passed. It seemed the highways were quiet again. But in June 1990, the silence was shattered. A body was found, and then another, and another. The police were about to realize they weren't dealing with a single incident. They were dealing with something bad. The highway criminal was active again, and this time the timeline was compressed. June 1st, 1990. David Spears, a 43-year-old construction worker, was found along US 19 in Citrus County. He was in bad condition and had been attacked 6 times with a tool. His case had many similarities to the Mallory case, but the connection wasn't yet made. June 6, 1990. Just 5 days later, another discovery. Charles Carskaddon, a 40-year-old part-time rodeo worker, was found in Pasco County. He was also in same condition. He had been attacked 8 times, again with the same tool. This time, there was another clue. Police learned that Carskaddon's hand tool had been pawned. The person who pawned it matched a vague description, but they were still grasping at straws. Aileen would later give a bizarre explanation for this specific act, claiming she attacked him after believing he was involved in bad crime. It was a story that made little sense. July 4th, 1990. The case breaks wide open. Peter Seams, a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman, disappeared. He was driving from Jupiter, Florida, to Arkansas. He was never found, but his car was a different story. Weeks after he disappeared, witnesses saw 2 women crash and abandon Seams' car in Volusia County. When police recovered the vehicle, they got 2 critical pieces of evidence. First, witnesses provided a description, leading to a composite sketch of the 2 women, one of whom was Aileen Wuornos. This sketch was distributed statewide. Second, investigators lifted a palm print from the car's door. Now, police had a face and a print. They also had a bad realization. The cases of Mallory, Spears, and Carskaddon were not hidden. A single criminal, or perhaps two, were luring men from the highways. The media frenzy began. A highway serial criminal was on the loose in Florida, and the public was chilled. The composite sketch was everywhere. Aileen and Tyria Moore saw it. The pressure was mounting. Aileen knew the police were looking for her, but the crime wasn't over. She was becoming more bad, more desperate. The net was beginning to close, but she hadn't been caught yet. 3 more men would meet their end before the police could finally put a name to the face on the poster. Even with her face plastered on a composite sketch across the state, Aileen Wuornos continued. August 4, 1990, Troy Burris, a 50-year-old traveling sausage salesman from Ocala, was reported missing during his delivery route. His truck was found abandoned. Later, he was discovered in the Ocala National Forest. He had 2 attacks. September 12, 1990, Charles Dick Humphreys, 56-year-old, was found along a Marion County road. Humphreys was a retired Air Force major and a former police chief. His status as a former law enforcement officer sent a particular chill through the investigators. He had been attacked 7 times, again with the same tool. November 19, 1990, the final victim. Walter Gino Antonio, 61-year-old, a security guard and a Brevard County Reserve deputy, was found along a remote road in Dixie County. He was engaged to be married. He was discovered wearing only socks, and he had been attacked 4 times. Near him, investigators noted a simple paper dinner napkin, a strange, out-of-place clue. The count was now 7 men, all linked by similar circumstances. The pressure on law authorities was immense, but they were finally connecting the dots. The palm print from Peter Seam's car was a major lead, but the real breakthrough came from the pawn shops. Investigators had been meticulously tracking items belonging to the victims. They found records for Richard Mallory's personal effects. They found the record for Charles Carskadden's pawned hand tool, and on one of those pawn shop receipts, they found a fingerprint. They ran the print. It matched the palm print from Seam's car, and both prints matched a name in their system. A woman with a long history of crimes, Aileen Lee Wuornos. They had her. They had her name. They had her face. They had her prints. They knew she was a drifter, known to frequent the biker bars of Volusia County. A team of undercover officers began to stake out her known hangouts. They finally tracked her to a place called The Last Resort, a rough biker-style dive bar where Lee was a regular. They knew she could be with Toole. They needed to get her out of the bar without a confrontation. On January 9, 1991, with the help of bar patrons, undercover officers lured Aileen outside. The arrest was about to happen, but catching her was only half the battle. They had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but they needed a confession. And to get it, they would use the one thing Aileen truly cared about against her. On January 9, 1991, Aileen Wuornos walked out of the Last Resort bar and into a swarm of undercover officers. She said, "I want to know what the hell is going on here. I'd like to know why I'm being arrested. For what? For what warrant?" She was arrested on an outstanding warrant, but she was immediately a suspect of highway crimes. Aileen was in custody, but she was tough. She was a survivor, accustomed to dealing with police. She wasn't talking. Investigators knew they had a solid case, but a confession would make it airtight. They also knew her partner, Tyria Moore, had fled to Pennsylvania. They realized Ty was Eileen's one and only weakness. So, they made a plan. They located Tyria Moore and, working with her, convinced her to cooperate. Tyria, fearing she could be prosecuted as an accomplice, agreed. The plan was simple. Tyria would call Aileen in jail, and the police would record everything. It was January 16, 1991. Tyria gets on the line. Tyria Moore said, "Lee, they're coming after me." Aileen, hearing the Ty's voice, immediately goes into protection mode. Her voice strains with emotion as she responds, "I'm not going to let you go to jail. Ty, I love you. If I have to confess everything just to keep you from getting in trouble, I will." And she did. In that moment, to save the woman she loved from any legal trouble, Aileen Wuornos sealed her own fate. She confessed. But it wasn't just a simple admission. In a separate, frantic call, she laid bare the motive that she would cling to for years. It wasn't just robbery, she claimed. It was love. Aileen Wuornos said, "Because I fell so badly in love with you that I was so worried about us not having an apartment, and I was scared that we were going to lose our place." I know it sounds crazy, but it's the truth. It was a full confession, born of a desperate, twisted love. Tyria Moore was never charged with any crime. Aileen, on the other hand, had just handed the prosecution everything they needed. The woman she had loved, the one person she had tried to protect, was the one who delivered the final blow. With the confession on tape, the state of Florida prepared its case. The trial was set, and the woman the papers dubbed the serial criminal was about to face the justice system. In January 1992, exactly 1 year after her arrest, Aileen Wuornos went on trial in Volusia County. This first trial was for the death of Richard Mallory. The courtroom was a media circus. This was the case of the first female serial criminal, and the public was hungry for a monster. The courtroom was presided over by Judge Uriel Larry Blount. The prosecution was led by the determined state attorney John Tanner, who painted Aileen as a cold, calculating criminal who lured men for money and their cars. He had the pawn shop receipts, he had the fingerprints, and he had those damning phone calls to Tyria Moore. On the other side was Aileen's defense team, led by public defender Tricia Jenkins. Their strategy was risky, but, they believed, truthful. They would not deny that Aileen ended Mallory's life. Instead, they would argue it was justifiable self-defense. When Aileen took the stand, the courtroom was silent. She testified, often emotionally, that Richard Mallory had been bad with her. She described the event, claiming he had attacked her and that she believed he was going to end her life. She told the jury she had to fight back, that it was him or her. It was a chilling story, consistent with the life of mistreatment she had always claimed to have endured. But John Tanner, the prosecutor, skillfully picked her story apart. He focused on the robbery. Why, if she was so scared, did she take his car? Why did she pawn his belongings? He portrayed her tears not as genuine remorse, but as the manipulative performance of a sociopath. Aileen's defense team wanted to introduce evidence of Richard Mallory's own past, his 1957 conviction for bad crime with intent to commit an attack. This would have shown the jury that Mallory had a history of crime, lending powerful credibility to Aileen's self-defense claim. But Judge Blount ruled against it. The information was deemed too old, too prejudicial, and was kept from the jury. The 12 people deciding Aileen's fate would deliberate without ever knowing that the man she claimed attacked her had been convicted of doing something chillingly similar in the past. They made their decision believing Mallory was just a respectable businessman. In her mind, the system wasn't just failing her, it was actively framing her. She had told her version of the truth, she claimed, and no one believed her. The jury delivered the verdict. Guilty. She was found guilty of the one crime she did was justified. This conviction changed everything. Her public defenders were preparing for the next 6 trials, ready to fight each one. But Aileen had a different plan. She was done. The guilty verdict in the Richard Mallory trial broke Aileen Wuornos. She felt betrayed by the court, by her lawyers, and by the world. She decided she would no longer participate in what she saw as a charade. From March 1992 to February 1993, as the state prepared to try her for the other crimes, Aileen stunned the courts. She fired her defense team and began to plead no contest or guilty to the remaining charges. She was, in effect, volunteering for her own execution. At a 1992 hearing, she addressed the judge directly. "I would really appreciate to be sent back to court immediately. I plead no contest and I meant that," she said. "It's the end of the line. I don't see why there should be a jury. I don't see why this should carry on. I've been framed. I've been set up. I'm ready to die and get out of your system." She received multiple death sentences, one after another, until she was officially condemned to die 6 times over. She was sent to Florida's Broward Correctional Institution, and there, for 10 long years, Aileen Wuornos waited. Aileen's case was no exception. Her mental state was already bad. She wrote thousands of letters, many of them filled with bizarre conspiracies. She claimed the police knew about the crimes all along, that the cops let this happen, and that her mind was being controlled by pressure. On July 20, 2001, in a statement she declared, "I attacked those men. I robbed them and I end them as cold as ice, and I'd do it again too. There's no chance in keeping me alive, 'cause I'd attack again. I hate my system." With this final declaration, she effectively waived all her remaining appeals. She was, as she said, ready to die. The state of Florida obliged and set her execution date. After 10 years, Aileen Wuornos had her wish. On October 9, 2002, at 9:47 a.m., Aileen Wuornos was dead by injection at Florida State Prison. In her final moments, she was calm, almost cheerful. The night before, she was allowed one last visitor. It was not Tyria Moore, the woman she had confessed for. It was Dawn Botkins, her best friend from their bad childhood in Michigan, the one who had said Aileen had the worst life of anyone I have ever met. Dawn recalled that final visit. Aileen finally admitted the truth, not the courtroom defense, but the truth as she felt it. She said she was definitely a serial criminal, Dawn said. Aileen explained it simply. It was all the years of the mistreatment, and then she started drinking. Plus Ty. Aileen kept saying that to me. That was quite the love, wasn't it? It was fatal. She was asked if she had any last words. She declined a traditional statement. Instead, with witnesses, prison staff, and Dawn Botkins watching, she smiled and delivered a final message. Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back, I'll be back. And with those words, her life ended. Eileen's remains were given to Don Botkins. Aileen had originally wanted them spread on Flagler's Beach in Florida, a place where she and Tyria Moore had shared happy memories. But Don convinced her otherwise. In a letter, Don told her, "You're coming home here to Michigan, and your remains are coming home with your best friend, and that's that." Aileen agreed. Dawn Botkins took her childhood friend's remains home and spread them under a beautiful walnut tree on her own property in Tuscola County, Michigan. She loved walnut trees, Dawn said. A final, quiet resting place, far from the highways and mistreatment of Florida. The case of Aileen Wuornos leaves us with no easy answers. The media narrative was simple, a monster who hated men. But the reality is a tangled, tragic mess. Was she a cold-hearted criminal, as the prosecution and her final confession claimed? Or was she a profoundly broken person, a victim of a lifetime of unspeakable mistreatment? Tell your thoughts in the comments below. Can someone be both a victim and a villain? Eileen's story forces us to look into the darkest parts of human nature, the part that creates the conditions for such a life to exist in the first place. Her story is a warning, a tragedy, and a complex puzzle that, even all these years later, we are still struggling to understand.